For decades, Princess Alexandra remained a silent observer, dignified, discreet, and loyal to the shadows of the crown. But in a rare and spine-tingling confession, she has broken protocol to reveal a staggering truth. Prince Philip, long thought to have withdrawn from royal strategy, secretly mentored Catherine in a series of covert meetings. These weren't casual chats, they were rehearsals for an entirely new kind of monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began not with a grand proclamation, but a hushed whisper in the East Wing of Windsor. Alexandra, ever the guardian of royal discretion, admitted to personally witnessing the beginnings of what would become a seismic shift in the monarchy's future. According to her account, Prince Philip would summon her under the cover of darkness, not to gossip or reminisce, but to confide in her a truth that had long lived in the undercurrents of the palace's silence. He believed that the crown, as it stood, was unprepared for the turbulence ahead, and in Catherine, he saw not a duchess but a dormant architect of renewal. These late-night meetings weren't happenstance. They were deliberate, rehearsed, and entirely off-record. Alexandra, torn between loyalty and duty, documented every moment in a journal sealed with violet wax and buried within her private study, marked only with the initials PCW Philip, Catherine, Windsor. Her decision to finally unseal that journal was triggered by a single event: King Charles's abrupt health decline. The crown must know the truth of its own rebirth, she wrote, her voice no longer trembling with fear but sharpened with urgency. What lay within its pages was not just recollection, it was revelation. Alexandra's long-standing relationship with both Elizabeth and Philip gave her unique proximity to the old guard and the rising storm. She had watched Elizabeth mentor with grace, and Philip command with precision. But in Catherine, Alexandra saw a convergence, a bridge between the people and the institution. The journal detailed evenings when Catherine would enter through service corridors, welcomed not by protocol officers, but by Philip himself, cloaked in silence and strategy. The topics? Not fashion, not family, but power, perception, and preparedness. And yet, laced within every entry was a shadow, a sense that these revelations were not meant to emerge under peaceful skies. Alexandra confessed to feeling a pang of betrayal toward Charles, not out of malice but mourning, for while he had inherited the crown, he had not inherited the confidence of his father. Philip's choice to train Catherine in secret wasn't accidental, it was tactical. He foresaw a moment of reckoning, a collapse of order, and the need for a figure who could lead not from lineage, but from earned allegiance. And perhaps most chilling of all was Alexandra's recurring phrase from her writings, always underlined in bold: Philip feared the chaos that would follow, and he chose Catherine. That choice, hidden behind decades of public formality, was now threatening to undo centuries of royal precedents. But how did Philip, a man sidelined in his twilight years, orchestrate something so radical beneath the palace's very nose? Within Alexandra's journal was one phrase repeated in crimson ink: Operation Perseus, a term whispered only in the most private royal quarters. It was Philip's final mission to ensure that when the monarchy trembled, a woman not born royal but forged by fire would rise unchallenged. Catherine wasn't chosen by fate, she was built for it. Behind the grandeur of palace walls and beneath the surface of public duty, Operation Perseus was the coded undertaking that would change everything. Conceived entirely by Prince Philip and kept beyond the reach of official documentation, it was more than preparation, it was prophecy. Perseus, the slayer of serpents, the guardian of ancient truths, this was not merely a mythological nod, it was a signal. Philip saw monsters brewing not in mythical caves, but in the corridors of modern monarchy, and only one woman, unburdened by the stagnancy of bloodline tradition, could stand between the crown and collapse. That woman was Catherine. His choice was not sentimental, it was surgical, strategic, survival-driven. The first known record of their clandestine alliance emerged in 2015, masked as a simple informal stroll through the Balmoral Gardens. But that walk was the beginning of Catherine's induction into a world of unspoken rules, coded language, and ancient obligations. Discreet. Said as casual mentorship, these meetings were choreographed to escape the scrutiny of household, staff, courtiers, and even Charles himself. A small circle of aides, hand-picked by Philip, were bound by personal loyalty and signed silence, some of them descendants of those who had served during Philip's naval years, others recruited from academic institutions with expertise in constitutional reform. These individuals were not merely servants of the crown, they were soldiers of a covert cause. Within Philip's private notes, later discovered in a locked drawer beneath a portrait of Queen Mary, lay a curriculum more meticulous than any royal education program ever publicly acknowledged. Constitutional balance appeared repeatedly in the margins, often paired with warnings, crisis inevitability, prepare counterbalance. Other topics included council dynamics, emergency protocol disruption, and public realignment models. At the center of every diagram, sketch, and annotated scenario was a single name, Catherine. She wasn't being prepared for the throne in the traditional sense, she was being primed for the vacuum that would follow collapse. Where others were taught legacy, she was trained in leverage. Philip didn't want a placeholder. He needed a protector, a Perseus, and what made Catherine extraordinary wasn't her aristocratic background. It was her psychological depth, her ability to listen, to remain composed under immense pressure, and to translate empathy into action became the defining elements of Operation Perseus. Philip reportedly told Alexandra, "She reads the room like she's reading your soul." That's not learned, that's instinct, and it was that instinct that convinced him she could withstand not only the public eye, but the private betrayal. He tested her not with privilege, but with pressure, constantly assessing how far she could stretch before she shattered. She never did, but if these sessions were merely intellectual, why did Philip insist on the consta? Auction of a hidden chamber deep within Windsor itself? Beneath the east wing of Windsor Castle lies a chamber long dismissed as storage, until Alexandra revealed it was repurposed by Philip himself. Dubbed the Crypt Room by insiders, it became the training ground where Catherine was stripped of title, comfort, and illusion, and taught the raw mechanics of power. Buried behind generations of silence and cloaked in architectural obscurity, the chamber had long been forgotten by most of the royal household. Originally constructed during the Second World War to hold relics too dangerous or sacred to be moved during air raids, it had remained untouched for decades until Philip saw its potential. According to Alexandra, he had the door reinforced, the lighting replaced with low amber sconces, and the walls lined with fireproof cabinets housing classified royal communiques. It wasn't a meeting room, it was a crucible, a private command center for one pupil and one architect. This was not a boo. Etiquette or symbolism. This was about confronting the brutal reality of monarchy under siege. Week after week, under the blanket of nightfall, Catherine would descend into that chamber. Not as a duchess, but as a disciple of a vision that defied centuries of tradition. There were no ceremonial uniforms, no security teams, just a single key, crafted from blackened steel and marked with the royal cipher, a key known only to Philip and Catherine as the obsidian pin. It was Alexandra who later revealed its true symbolic weight. Obsidian cuts deeper than gold. And Philip knew Catherine would need to cut through centuries of silence if she was ever to rise on her own terms. Inside the crypt room, Catherine was handed materials no other royal had ever studied. Queen Victoria's private black letters, filled with constitutional anxieties and moral conflicts, were laid bare before her. Churchill's wartime field orders, annotated in ink, were read aloud in silence. Philip didn't lecture, he aid her listen. Listen to how power behaves when it's at risk of extinction. Listen to how legacy is protected through ruthlessness and sacrifice. Catherine would later recount one moment that still echoes in her mind. It was after she had finished reading a particularly grim memorandum from 1942, detailing the contingency plans for a royal evacuation in the event of German invasion. Philip stood beside her, quiet, before finally saying, "One day, you'll command not just ceremony but consequence." It wasn't praise, it was preparation. He was forging her not to play a role but to hold a line. And as she absorbed those words, the real transformation began. Gone was the idea of being a consort in waiting. In its place stood the foundations of a constitutional architect in training, one who would later make decisions that Parliament itself hadn't anticipated. Years before any of it reached public knowledge, Before Charles's illness and before Camilla's withdrawal, Catherine had already begun drafting mental blueprints of a post-traditional monarchy. As Catherine absorbed history's weight in the silence of stone, Philip was preparing her for something more than resilience. He was grooming her for resistance. It wasn't enough to know history. Philip needed Catherine to feel it. In scenes that echo military training more than royal protocol, the Duchess was placed in simulated crises, from media ambushes to staged betrayal scenarios. These weren't rehearsals, they were emotional crucibles. Philip understood something the rest of the royal family often ignored. Protocol cannot withstand chaos if the person upholding it has never bled beneath its weight. So he didn't merely test Catherine's knowledge, he engineered collapse around her to see what remained standing. One morning, without warning, Catherine was blindsided by a meticulously planted media scandal. A false but convincing leak about her alleged involvement in a diplomatic blunder spread through internal networks. Aides refused to brief her. Phones went silent. The press team vanished. She was left alone to confront a wall of headlines that never existed and yet felt absolutely real. When she finally uncovered the source, it led back to Philip's private aide, with a single note left on her desk: "Learn to breathe beneath the fire." And that was only the beginning. Inside the crypt room and beyond, Catherine faced fabricated royal council simulations designed to mimic the fiercest internal conflicts. Alexandra, always elegant but calculating, would assume the role of a disillusioned senior royal. Anne, cold and precise, played a hardline constitutionalist who questioned Catherine's every decision. Every scenario escalated. Parliament in deadlock, a crisis of succession, a leaked private letter from Charles causing diplomatic uproar. And through each unfolding layer, Catherine had to respond not just with poise, but with strategy. She failed often. She second-guessed herself. She wept, once, in front of Philip. And in that moment of unraveling, when the silence swallowed her, he delivered the line that would shape her entire reign. "Then stand up as queen." Those 5 words weren't advice. They were a command, a test, and she stood. Philip's techniques mirrored his own wartime psychology, the same drills he had endured aboard naval vessels under siege. He believed the only way to prepare Catherine for the inevitable collapse of old royal structures was to immerse her in controlled detonations. Each simulation was a detour from comfort and a direct descent into constitutional hell. Yet what emerged from these firestorms was not fragility but focus. Catherine evolved from a diplomatic figurehead into a strategist with calibrated instincts. She began anticipating moves before they were made. Her silence became intentional, her kindness surgical, and while these sessions were hidden from public view, they rewired Catherine's entire approach to power. She no longer needed validation to lead. She understood timing, perception, and consequence. She was becoming something the monarchy had not seen since Elizabeth I, a sovereign mind disguised in civilian grace. But as Catherine was forged in secret, the public narrative told a different story, and someone else sensed it unraveling. Outwardly, Camilla smiled for the cameras, the public, and the palace. But behind those smiles was a rising panic. Something in Catherine's calm unnerved her. The way palace aides deferred to her. The way Philip's schedule became erratic. What Camilla feared wasn't visible authority, it was unseen allegiance. It began with subtleties. Aides who once answered only to the king's household were now quietly circulating around Catherine's calendar. Philip's former equerries were spotted briefing her behind closed doors, briefings Camilla hadn't been made aware of. What first seemed like coincidence soon congealed into pattern. Philip was no longer content watching from the sidelines. He was back in Motio. Anne and Catherine was at the epicenter. Camilla's unease transformed into determination, and she went straight to the one person who would never lie to her face, Princess Anne. But Anne, ever the strategist, offered nothing more than a glance and a single cryptic line. Some inherit command. Others are prepared for it. It wasn't a denial, it was a warning. Camilla, never one to sit idle in the face of ambiguity, began combing through internal communications. What she found shattered her confidence. Catherine's name appeared repeatedly on security logs for briefing clearances far beyond the remit of a future consort. classified intelligence dispatches, access to Constitutional Council, and even early foreign policy assessments were being routed through a quiet but consistent channel authorized not by Charles, but by Philip. The realization hit with the weight of betrayal. This wasn't favoritism, this was foundation laying. Camilla attempted to act swiftly. A high-level diplomatic trip to the Balkans was scheduled, and she moved to have Catherine's name quietly removed from the itinerary, citing an overload of family duties. It was subtle, administrative, a power play disguised as protocol. But the response was immediate and brutal. A formal letter arrived at Clarence House within hours. Signed personally by Prince Philip, it was short, sharp, and devastating. Any attempt to undermine preparations already in motion will be noted. The future of the crown is not subject to personal discomfort. It was not just a rebuke, it was a line drawn in stone. Camilla, stunned, turned to the only person she still believed could restore clarity, Charles. But even he, weathered and weary, offered no comfort. Instead, he listened quietly, eyes lowered, as Camilla recounted her fears. When she finished, he offered no counsel, only silence. A silence that spoke of complicity, or perhaps inevitability. Camilla had lost something more than ground. She had lost access. The shadows around C. Catherine were no longer passive. They moved with strategy, and every movement left Camilla further isolated. She began noticing the way footmen changed their greetings, the way doors opened for Catherine just a second faster than for her. This wasn't optics, it was structure. And behind that structure stood Philip, engineering what the monarchy didn't yet understand it needed. But by the time Camilla realized the full scale of Catherine's positioning, Philip had already sealed the final stage of Operation Perseus with Alexandra as witness. 3 days before his final public appearance, Prince Philip summoned Princess Alexandra and handed her a velvet-bound folder sealed with the insignia of Mountbatten. Inside was a single letter written in his own trembling hand. Its subject line, "Final Act, entrust to Catherine upon confirmation of crisis." The folder wasn't kept in the royal archives, nor registered in the palace's official document log. Instead, it disappeared into Alexandra's private vault, a chamber known only to 2 individuals, herself and Philip. He had entrusted it to her with a single condition. It was to be opened only if the monarchy entered what he called a crisis of continuity. That moment came when Charles collapsed during a closed-door Privy Council session, an event never disclosed to the public, but confirmed through internal briefings. As aides scrambled to control the narrative, Alexandra unlocked the vault. What she found wasn't just a letter, it was a blueprint for succession by design, not bloodline. Philip had not drafted a farewell. He had orchestrated a final maneuver. The letter began not with affection but instruction. It outlined a vision that stood in defiant contrast to the monarchy's archaic rigidity, a hybrid model that fused ceremonial tradition with strategic maternal authority. This institution, Philip wrote, cannot survive on lineage alone. It must be led by one who understands both the people and the machine. He didn't name Catherine as queen. He named her as guardian. That word, capitalized and underlined, marked the pivot point of the entire plan. Guardian of continuity, guardian of truth, guardian of the crown's silent reforms. The gravity of his language left Alexandra in tears, later admitting she felt as though she were reading the end of one world and the beginning of another. Tucked within the folder were more than words. Enclosed were 2 sealed access codes, one granting entry to restricted wings of the royal archives, and the other to a set of sealed correspondences exchanged between Philip and constitutional advisors during the late 1990s. It became clear that this plan had not been hastily assembled in Philip's final years. It had been decades in the making, refined and buried beneath layers of ceremonial distraction. And though Charles had worn the crown, it was Catherine who had been granted the map to protect its future. One phrase, handwritten and repeated 3 times, read, "Not all heirs must be declared. Some must be deployed." The most unsettling revelation was this: Philip had deliberately kept William in the dark. The final envelope inside the folder was addressed to Catherine alone. Alexandra hesitated before reading its cover inscription aloud. You will not find allies, you will create them. Use the silence as your sword. It wasn't just a warning, it was a crowning. And in that moment, Alexandra understood the depth of Philip's conviction. He didn't hope Catherine would rise. He engineered her ascension through invisible scaffolding, anchored by trust, not title. As the velvet folder reached Catherine's hands, the final piece of Philip's legacy clicked into place, unseen, yet irreversible. When Catherine walked into the Blue Room of Buckingham Palace holding Philip's folder, no cameras captured the moment. But those inside recall a hush like thunder. Charles, frail, reflective, listened as his father's words echoed from Catherine's lips. She wasn't asking permission. She was delivering instruction. The tension in the room was unlike anything Buckingham had seen in years. What stood between them wasn't protocol, it was the ghost of a man who had prepared a future in secret. Catherine spoke calmly, but with undeniable command, quoting from Philip's letter not as evidence but as directive. Constitutional clauses once buried in the archives were brought forward with surgical precision. She cited them one by one, articles Philip had quietly annotated, powers she now invoked not by birthright, but by succession of trust. Charles sat quietly, absorbing the weight of what was unfolding, his breath shallow, his silence deafening. There was no dispute, only the sound of an institution shifting beneath the weight of its own denial. For a moment the silence was broken not by Charles but by Camilla. She stepped forward, voice shaking, accusing Catherine of overstepping, of politicizing grief. But Catherine didn't flinch. She turned, folder still in hand, and said just 7 words that brought the room to stillness. This is between monarchs, not courtiers. The effect was immediate. Camilla froze, words swallowed. No one spoke after that, not even the staff standing nearby. What followed was not a declaration but an acknowledgement. Charles looked up at Catherine with eyes that held both sorrow and clarity. He always said you were more than you appeared, he whispered. It was the closest thing to abdication she would ever hear aloud. In that moment, Charles handed Catherine a series of sealed documents tied to ceremonial command documents that gave her administrative privileges previously reserved for the sovereign or the reigning consort. While not a transfer of crown or title, insiders knew what had just occurred. The balance had shifted, and it was irreversible. Philip's folder, still clutched in Catherine's hand, had become the bridge between legacy and reinvention. What began as silent preparation was now institutional reality. Her VO. Ice carried weight beyond titles. Her presence reshaped the room, and her decisions no longer required pre-approval. Behind closed doors, whispers began to circulate. Senior aides described the scene as the true passing of the crown, not of jewels, but of judgment. And though the official channels made no announcements, something inside the palace had undeniably changed. The line of succession remained untouched on paper, but power had moved not upward nor downward, but sideways, into the hands of the one person who had been trained to hold it when the storm came. But the world still didn't know, and it would take Alexandra's televised interview to send shockwaves across the globe. The cameras rolled. Alexandra, poised yet shaking, sat before the nation and spoke a truth generations were never meant to hear. Prince Philip chose Catherine, not as heir but as architect. Within hours, media exploded. The palace refused comment, and Catherine's approval ratings soared past royalty itself. It was a broadcast that lasted only 17 minutes, but it cracked open a vault of secrets that had been bolted shut for nearly a decade. Airing on the BBC with no prior announcement, the segment was framed as a personal reflection by Princess Alexandra, but from the moment she uttered Philip's name it became clear this was no ordinary tribute. She didn't mince words. He trained her. He trusted her. He prepared her not for pomp but for collapse. It was an unmasking of monarchy's most closely guarded operation. Within minutes, social media lit up with a new phrase, the new coronation. But it wasn't about crowns or titles. It was about a transfer of moral authority, not ceremonial rule. Screens across the world replayed Alexandra's calm but devastating quote, "She was not prepared for the throne. She was prepared for the storm." Analysts, stunned and scrambling, dug into archival footage, statements, even old royal travel logs. What they uncovered wasn't just corroboration, it was coordination. Leaked internal documents soon surfaced, showing that Prince Philip had issued private handwritten directives to MI5 in 2017, requesting quiet contingency measures for the protection of one designate sea. These weren't ceremonial precautions, they were tactical. Extra layers of surveillance had been discreetly placed around Catherine during overseas visits, and new encryption protocols were implemented for her communications, separate from standard royal channels. It was undeniable this had been real, and that it had been active for years. The public reaction was explosive. Within 48 hours, polls showed a dramatic spike in support for Catherine, surpassing not just Camilla but even Charles himself. Meanwhile, civil sentiment toward the current sovereign took a sharp turn. Questions erupted in Parliament. How much had Charles known? Why had Camilla been granted such visibility while Catherine had been cloaked in silence? Commentators called it the monarchy's reckoning. Petitions flooded Downing Street demanding Catherine's immediate elevation to a formal constitutional role. For the first time in living memory, the public wasn't just accepting a royal, it was rallying around her as a leader of national resilience. Catherine, silent until now, issued a brief but earth-shaking statement from Clarence House. It didn't come through the royal press office. It came as an open letter, signed not as princess, nor as duchess, but as guardian of the crown's continuity. She acknowledged the storm, honoured Philip's foresight, and committed to transparency going forward. "We are stewards of a legacy we must also be brave enough to evolve," she wrote. In that moment, the monarchy was no longer just a symbol, it became a voice. Inside palace walls, meetings that once centered on tradition shifted toward reform. Legal advisors began reassessing long-dormant constitutional clauses. Quiet discussions of succession timing gained momentum, and at the center of it all was Catherine, not as a placeholder, not as a consort, but as a model of what a new monarchy could look like. The nation wasn't just watching her now, it was aligning with her. And yet, one question lingers like a ghost in Windsor's halls. What did Philip see coming that made him prepare Catherine in the dark? Prince Philip is gone. But in every decision Catherine now makes, his fingerprints remain etched in silence, shadow, and stone. Some say she leads with her own voice now. Others say Philip's ghost walks with her in every council chamber. One thing is certain, the monarchy will never again be what it was. In the months following Alexandra's broadcast and the global shift it triggered, Catherine's style has emerged not with a roar, but with a deliberate quiet that unnerves and commands in equal measure. She doesn't dismantle institutions, she absorbs them, reshapes them, and then stands still long enough for the world to realize that everything around her has changed. Her leadership is deep, indeed not by sweeping declarations but by strategic stillness. She grants audiences to parliament members who once dismissed her. She reframes state dinners into forums for policy consensus. She attends memorials not as guest but as steward. The shift is subtle but unmistakable. There is a new gravitational center within the monarchy and its pull is unmistakably hers. Still, not everyone has followed. A faction within the palace, known quietly as the Continuance, remains stubbornly tethered to Charles's reign. They move slowly, hesitantly, trying to recapture influence that has already evaporated. They whisper about broken hierarchy, bypassed authority, and unauthorized briefings. But their dissent only underscores the truth that Philip foresaw that tradition without adaptation is a trap. Catherine doesn't confront them. She doesn't need to. Their resistance is becoming background noise against a growing public rhythm that chants her name louder with each passing day. Alexandra, when asked to explain Philip's foresight, gave a haunting response. He wasn't preserving the past. He was saving the future. That sentiment now lingers like scripture across the halls of Windsor, and within that sacred storm of memory, whispers have begun to circulate about one final document, Appendix Windsor 4, allegedly drafted by Philip during a private retreat to Balmoral and locked in a compartment only accessible by dual key. It is said to contain emergency structural reforms for the monarchy should public trust collapse. While no one has officially acknowledged its existence, aides close to the Queen's circle have confirmed that a recent diplomatic visit to Balmoral included archival engagements of significant gravity. Beyond palace walls, something extraordinary is unfolding. Among the youth, Catherine has taken on a new title, the Queen of Continuity. They don't wait for coronations or televised ceremonies. They follow action, presence, strength. On university campuses, in cultural circles, and across digital forums, she is the symbol of controlled transformation, not disruptive but decisive, not radical but unyielding. And perhaps that is the truest legacy Philip left, not in bloodline or tradition, but in the ability to evolve beneath the weight of history without letting it crush you. And in the deepest corner of St. George's Chapel, behind rows of stone and silence, a single candle burns before Philip's crypt. It is not part of any formal ritual. There is no plaque, no guard, only a flame placed there by Catherine alone. She returns there once a month, unannounced, never photographed. She kneels, says nothing, and leaves. Because she knows the man who prepared her for battle never needed applause. He only needed to know that the crown would not fall. And through her it hasn't. It has risen. The crown may rest on a head, but the true power lies in the hands of those trained in silence, and Catherine, by Philip's design, now holds it all. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.